Hi, everyone. We will start, and we assume that people will join us in the upcoming minutes. Can everyone hear me? Yeah? Okay, great. So my name is Merav Kahana Dagan. I'm the deputy head at the Mitvim Institute. And I want to thank you all for joining us at this webinar, where we will try to figure out how will the new Biden administration approach the Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking. And I want to thank everyone, both at the Mitvim, the Israeli Institute for Regional Foreign Policies, and ALLMEP, Alliance for Middle East Peace, for joining us here. Each of our speakers will have 5 minutes for opening remarks, and then we will open up the floor for questions. Please write it down in the chat box. And if you can refer the question to someone specific, it will also be helpful for us. I will introduce each of the speaker before they speak, and that's it. So our first speaker would be Huda Abu-Arkoud, the regional director of ALLMEP. Huda joined ALLMEP in 2014. She has experience in conflict resolution, NGO leadership, social change, education, and activism. As a Fulbright scholar, she studied conflict transformation and peace studies. She's also the co-founder of the Center for Transformative Education, the CTE. She's an active leader in grassroots Palestinian initiatives, especially focusing on women empowerment and people-to-people diplomacy. And she will share with us today a perspective from a Palestinian point of view. So Huda, the floor is yours. You can unmute yourself. Thank you.
Thank you, Merav. Thank you, Mitvim. And it's an honor for me to speak tonight. It's almost tonight here in the Middle East about this very important junction, actually, in the relationship between the Palestinian Authority and the upcoming Biden administration. If everything goes smoothly, inshallah, we will have Biden in the White House by January 20th. And I think this is the time, until then, this is the time for the Palestinian Authority to start working on a strategy to communicate directly with Biden administration, to be proactive rather than waiting for initiatives to come from the Biden administration. The administration has a lot on its plate, domestically speaking, and they will not actually, at least for the first year, be engaged that effectively with the Middle East. So I would encourage the Palestinian Authority to come forward and start these conversations with the Biden administration now, rather than waiting even until January. And one of the things that we need to put on the table is a proposal that speaks to the Palestinian national aspirations, that is based on the international law and whatever agreements that both the Israelis and Palestinians signed in the past. I do believe that any peace agreement, and in the context, in the Israeli-Palestinian context, there is no lack of agreements, but there is lack of support for these agreements. And here comes the role of the civil society in both Israel and Palestine. And I think we need to be given the liberty to start working on some of the issues that has to do with the stallment of the peace process between the Israelis and Palestinians. If we are looked at as the only entity that can build trust between the two people, pave the way for peace talks between the grassroots levels, then I think it's also our role. I see a very crucial role for us as civil society, both in Palestine and in Israel, but also I would say that joining forces with other civil society organizations in the United States to bring forward the Palestinian-Israeli grassroots perspective. And I would encourage more women to be engaged in that conversation, because I've spent a lot of time studying how women kind of change the dynamics of any kind of talks, peace agreements, and engagement. Although their participation was limited to 9%, of all the agreements done between 1995 till the deal of the century. So I think it's important for us as a civil society, and I would be happy to call it now, to create our own initiative, go to both leadership with the initiative as civil society, go to the Biden administration with that initiative. It's a lot of work, but what we need to do is to focus on initiative that speaks to the aspirations of the Israelis and Palestinians, acknowledges their multi-narratives, acknowledges their trauma and their emotional connection to Palestine and Israel, and include everyone in that conversation in the Israeli-Palestinian political spectrum. And I think it's important for us to bring that voice to the Biden administration now, because I don't think they will wait until our leaders, figure out the internal issues they are dealing with, whether it's in Israel or Palestine. We have a very unstable political situation. So I think it's for the civil society to start moving towards opening a conversation with the Biden administration without compromising any of the political leverage that the governments have in this. But we cannot just sit and wait. And this is what I'm gonna propose today, that we should not just wait for invitations, we should be proactive. And I'm speaking as a Palestinian activist. We need to get in touch with this administration ASAP and put something for them to work with, rather than waiting for an initiative coming from here or there, because literally they will be very busy with domestic affairs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Huda. I definitely agree with the fact that we need more women in this process, and we will probably speak more about that. Our next speaker would be Dr. Nimrod Goren. He's the head and the founder of Mitvim Institute. He is also a teaching fellow at the Middle Eastern Studies at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He holds a PhD in Middle Eastern Studies and political psychology from the Hebrew University. And Nimrod will focus, or will analyze a little bit more about the new momentum for dealing with the Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking. So Nimrod, you have 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mirav, and thank you to ALLMEP for this joint event with us at Mitvim. Definitely the Biden victory provides new momentum for those dealing with Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking. After several years that we were focusing mostly on damage control to what Trump was doing. I will try to propose 4 types of steps that could be done in order to advance peace as much as possible. The first is about promoting new policy directions, and it's clear that while the Trump administration, the Biden administration, will not make an effort to launch final status talks in the near future, it won't be effective. It definitely should update the American positions, stepping back from the Trump plan, reaffirming the commitment to the two-state solution, and voicing opposition to negative steps happening on the ground, while reversing actual steps taken by the previous administration in terms of funding, in terms of how it relates to the Palestinian diplomatic representation in Washington and to the American representation in Jerusalem on the ground. Those type of updating and reversal of steps will likely restore the trust between the US and the Palestinian leadership, repositioning the Americans as a credible mediator for peace, a place it wasn't there in the last 4 years. The second issue is about giving the Israeli-Palestinian issue a higher than anticipated priority. We've been hearing that it will not be a priority for the new administration. Well, it makes sense, we don't expect too much, but for us, Israelis and Palestinians committed to advancing peace, for us, it's urgent, for us, it's important, and this is a message that we need to advance and voice to our American partners. Negative steps are happening on the ground. More and more obstacles to peace are being put in place. We see Givat HaMatos just over the last few days, and there needs to be a clear voice from Washington saying that the topic, the issue is important, it's urgent, that the resolution is possible, is necessary, And that will be kind of backwind to us on the ground working to advance peace. It's important for us. The third point is about effective multilateralism. We hear that the Biden administration will definitely work in a multilateral manner on different foreign policy issues. It will be a continuation to how Obama worked. It will be in response to coronavirus. It will be as part of an effort to restore transatlantic ties. It should also come into play in Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking and in a much more effective manner than we saw previous multilateral efforts under Obama. Those weren't very successful, and we can elaborate why later on. So multilateral steps can include new mechanisms to support Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking, including countries from Europe, from the Arab world, current quartet members, and also engaging with pro-peace Israelis and Palestinians. It can include new parameters for conflict resolution that reflect international consensus and are up to date with regional developments. It could include the international incentive package that was discussed in previous years and were not acted upon until now. It can include coordinated support to civil society activities, like the international fund that ALLMEP is advancing. And finally, leveraging regional developments to promote Israeli-Palestinian peace. Much has been happening on the regional landscape in recent years. There has been an improvement under Trump of Israel-Gulf relations, but that was done in a way to bypass the Palestinian issue, and that should be transformed, utilize the new relations between Israel and the UAE and others in order to promote peace rather than prevent peace. Second, under Trump, that there has been a deterioration in relation between Israel and two important neighbors that are relevant to the Palestinian issue, both Jordan and Turkey. Those relations should be transformed. The Americans should invest efforts in improving them. That could open up new opportunities for Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking. And lastly, the Eastern Mediterranean Gas Forum, a new regional organization, including both Israel and the Palestinian Authority. It doesn't happen very often, plus Arab state, plus European states. How do you transform that entity, not only for economic gains, but also for political gains and to foster Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking? So these are 4 steps or types of steps that could be taken. None of them on its own will reach the final status agreement that we yearn for, but all of them together could create a different climate in which I think prospects for peace will be better than they are today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nimrod. Our next speaker is Lucy Curtin Bogan. She's the director of the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict Program at the U.S. Institute for Peace, USIP. She focuses on the interplay of Israeli and Palestinian civil society in peace-building efforts and official diplomacy. She joined the USIP in 2010. She also worked with the U.S. Department of State as a language specialist and as a program officer at the Kennedy School of Government's Middle East Initiative. And she will share with us the possible next steps of the new administration, as well as some steps that the current administration still might take in the upcoming months. And of course, Lucy, you can relate to what Nimrod just talked about, and we can also do that later on at the Q&A step. Thank you.
Thank you, Meirav, and thank you to ALLMEP and to Mitvim for hosting this conversation and for inviting me to be part of it, particularly to be joining such respected colleagues and friends in this discussion. So as Meirav said, I will be focusing on what we might see from the presumptive incoming Biden administration. Just a quick word up front for those who might not be familiar with the organization which I work, the U.S. Institute of Peace. It's a nonpartisan U.S. congressional funded institute, independent of the executive branch. So I'm not coming at this analysis as an insider or point person from the incoming administration or the current administration, but rather I'll just be focusing my analysis on what we know from our own experience, what we've heard from members of the incoming administration about what their posture is likely to be, and see what some of the challenges and opportunities they might face as they turn their attention in some measure to this conflict. So first, things we do know, and you'll hear some overlap here in some of what we've heard as well from Nimrod and Huda. We know from President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Senator Kamala Harris, that this is an administration that strongly supports Israel and the US-Israel relationship, strongly supports the pursuit of a two-state solution, strongly opposes Israeli unilateral actions on territories, specifically annexation. We know there will be no moving the embassy back. Biden has already said that. He was a supporter of the initial 1995 Embassy Act that relates to this. This is a very in-the-know crowd, so most people will know what I'm referring to there. We also know from statements they've made that there will be a focus on restoring economic and humanitarian assistance to the Palestinians. That will be a priority agenda item to try to accomplish, and an attempt to address the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. And this would be what I call more broadly an effort to reset the US-Palestinian relationship. So in addition to aid, I think we're going to be looking at, again, from things that we've heard from them say themselves, looking to reopen the US consulate, the representation to the Palestinians in Jerusalem, and looking into reopening a PLO mission in Washington. Now, that may not be as easily done as said. There are certainly some legislative congressional hurdles there. That might be something Kevin gets into, or something that we can get into in the conversation later on. But also, speaking of resetting, there will also be a focus by the incoming administration on resetting the US posture towards the JCPOA, or otherwise known as the Iran deal. And I'm being careful here to say that broadly, because I'm not sure that necessarily means a complete 180 in terms of jumping right back into the deal as it was left at the end of the Obama administration. There's certainly no intent to let the current withdrawal from that agreement stand. And I think that is what we will see as the priority foreign policy Middle East agenda item for the administration. So why do I bring up Iran here? It's a different issue than the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but as we all know, it's not without its relation to that consideration. Returning to the agreement could mend or go a long way to mending the wide rift in US-European relations, something that Nimrod just spoke about and something we know Biden is keen to do. But the incoming Biden administration is also well aware of Israel's position and certain Gulf Arab states' position on this conflict. And I think it's going to be hard to consider the approach on one without relating to how what it does on one affects its ability to get things done on the other front. And of course, the incoming administration is well aware that the Israel and certain Gulf Arab states' view of how the Obama administration approached Iran went a long way to getting us to where we see today with the Abraham Accords. So again, this has broad relevance across the region. And speaking of the Abraham Accords, again, something Nimrod has mentioned, we also know this is an administration that will continue to be supportive of the idea of peace or normalization agreements between Israel and the Arab world. I think we're much more likely to see them do, again, something Nimrod suggested, which is try as much as possible to tie those developments to serve as a bridge to, as leverage towards promoting progress on the Israeli-Palestinian front. Again, things we can talk about in more detail in the discussion. What do we not know? I said earlier, some formulation to the extent of we'll see what the administration does when it turns its attention in some measure to the conflict. Again, something that's been mentioned, there is an assumption that this is not going to be an issue that rises to priority, a full-scale, robust effort on day one, the way we saw, frankly, with the Obama administration to appoint an envoy and push the parties towards, final status negotiations. There is a packed domestic agenda, foreign policy agenda, transnational issues agenda that this administration will have to deal with. And also Biden, after many, many years in the Senate and serving as vice president under President Obama, is well aware of the perils and of going big, and that failing in going big is not cost-free, either in terms of political capital expended at home, but also in terms of further erosion of trust by the parties and setting things back further. You very much risk doing a 1 step forward, 10 steps back in terms of getting back going again at whatever point the time is ripe. That said, I think it's also important for us to note that this is a conflict that successive administrations have learned it forces its way back on the agenda, given the way things will play out. And that might be no more so the case than depending on what happens over the next couple of months with an outgoing Trump administration. If this administration sees an opportunity or seizes an opportunity, the current administration, to try to consolidate gains it is trying to make along the lines of its goals and worldview on this conflict. The incoming administration might find its hand forced in terms of what it sees as day one and what it has to do to correct course in line with the priorities it has set. So just one example of this we saw in the last couple of weeks, US Ambassador to Israel Friedman signing agreements in Ariel with the Israeli leadership, renewed agreements, science and technology agreements, but renewing them while taking out what had been a prohibition since those agreements started in the 1970s of US funding going to projects that were being conducted over the Green Line. So if we see continued attempts like that at policies that seek to blur the distinction between a US policy approach or view of territory on either side of the Green Line, again, the Biden administration's hand might be forced to deal with the issue. So I will let, I guess, I'll let Nadav maybe speak to what the Israeli leadership's approach might be to that and how, as it calibrates its approach towards a new US administration, how eager or not it might be to push or accept such kind of moves. And that's something maybe, again, we can talk about in the discussion. I would say in terms of opportunities, again, the Abraham Accords I've already mentioned and Nimrod mentioned, I think this administration will see them as opportunity. I don't know how robustly it will pursue new ones, and there'll be other challenges as it engages on other issue areas with some of the Gulf states. Again, something we can reserve for greater detail for discussion. But there will be an effort, as I said, and I think there is some real opportunity with the right political will and strategy by this administration to try to leverage this new dynamic to good effect. I think there's also an opportunity, as referenced, to reset the US-Palestinian relationship. But again, as I mentioned when it came to the Iran deal, I'm not sure we should all expect to see a complete 180 on all decisions made by the Trump administration. And I would just say that in terms of both the parties, Israelis and Palestinians, as they approach their calculations on how to engage this new administration, and I agree fully with Huda that the Palestinians will need to be taking a much more proactive approach. So in the same way that the Israelis might well be concerned, given the relationship and the strained as it was under the Obama administration, they might be concerned that the Biden approach will be part two of the Obama approach. I think there are reasons not to see it purely through that lens. I think Biden is different. There are some lessons he's learned. But so at the same time, they can expect that Biden's not going to want to go in from day one and have high profile conflict with Israel, having also stated upfront that two-state solution is the goal. They will not be able to easily let stand decisions made, I think, by an Israeli government that fly strongly in the face of that. On the Palestinian side, they can expect a strong effort to reset the relationship, bring the Palestinians back into the fold as a partner to restore, as I've talked about, aid, representation to the Palestinians. But this will not be an expectation or cost-free approach to the Palestinians. So there'll be many expectations that come along with this administration, despite all the talk and analysis that politics are leaning in a particular way in the Democratic Party that more favor certain positions towards the Palestinians versus the Israelis. This is a pretty centrist standard administration you see coming in, represented by Biden and Harris. And there are certain strongly, I'd say almost consensus views that you will find across still among Democrats and bipartisan on certain issues, including things like the prisoner payments issue. Again, we can get into that later, including expectations that the Palestinians should think about going back to accepting the tax revenue returns, to cooperation again on the security front with Israelis. So again, I think both parties need to calibrate and manage their expectations as they consider how they engage. I would just, because I think I'm at the tip of my 5 minutes, maybe beyond it, I would just say, to sum up, that again, I don't see big launching the negotiation efforts, as all of us has said, and none of us, I think, expect. But I think in an effort to make sure that they are securing this ability to preserve the potential for a two-state solution, there will be all the sorts of interim measures we've already heard talk about. And I'd like to take this opportunity, especially because Huda talked about civil society, and it is an important piece of this, to take this opportunity to congratulate ALLMEP on the recent agreement on the Senate part to fund the Middle East Partnership for Peace fund and congratulate all the efforts that have gone in from Kevin and Huda and John, and of course their predecessor Joel Brownell before that to bring this to fruition. And of course that will be a piece of legislation, bipartisan legislation, that really brings an opportunity for when you're looking at important preparing the ground kind of steps, to prepare the ground to be able to support meaningful negotiations at some point. That kind of investment, in addition to the aid and humanitarian assistance we've talked about, will go a long way to preparing the ground in an inclusive way for what might happen further into administration. So I will stop there and thank you.
Thank you very much, Lucy. And from now, we will move on to John Linden. He's the executive director of ALLMEP. He was actually ALLMEP's first European director, founding its new office in Paris back in 2018. He has over a decade of experience in leading NGO concerned with the conflict resolution and international development, with particular focus on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the role of civil society can play in any lasting resolution. John will share with us a European and geopolitical analysis. So thank you, John.
Thanks so much, Merav, and thank you everybody for joining us, and Mitvim for partnering on this event, and Lucy, thank you also for the warm words about the progress with the Middle East Partnership for Peace Act. So I think the first thing to say from a European perspective following the results of the election is that Europeans are used to grumbling about American policy on the Middle East. It's sort of it's a very long-term hobby of European policy analysts, but the last 3 to 4 years have been particularly trying. And I would say that it has been an opportunity for the European Union to try and step up. It's very easy to critique another actor's position on a conflict like this, but the vacuum left really from the withdrawal of US sort of multilateral leadership over the last few years allowed, I mean, the relatively new Commission President von der Leyen to say this will be a geopolitical commission, and trying to really express the European Union's economic and cultural weight in a diplomatic sense. And I think it would be fair to say that that has not been necessarily an incredibly successful endeavor for structural reasons that go beyond any individual or even the intention of the European Union or member states. And it's useful to do a comparison here. I mean, Secretary Pompeo will be spending some of this week in the region, and he is able to change, as is outgoing President Trump, US policy on Israel-Palestine in the process of a speech or, the flick of a pen, whereas structurally the European Union is very much bound in with requiring consensus amongst all 27 member states before any significant changes in European policy. I think what you've seen through the annexation crisis this year, as well as the reception to the Trump peace plan, the first part of the year, is an inability of the European Union to be able to relate necessarily to some of those quite disruptive events. And in that sense, most capitals in the continent, and certainly in Brussels itself, they very much welcomed the results of the election and the idea that we're going to be having a return to US leadership and to multilateralism. And we'll see how that plays out over the next 4 years, but it is definitely a stark contrast to how the previous 4 years have gone. And there's some kind of relative strengths and weaknesses with both parties that I think would really sort of make sense of the fact that multilateral partnership can deliver goods here. Whilst the United States can move quite quickly and obviously has a lot of trust, particularly of Israelis, sort of counterintuitively for the Palestinians, there has been a degradation of trust over the last 4 years. And it's not as if the period before that either, that we saw sort of very, very high levels of trust between the Palestinian people and the Palestinian Authority and the United States. And a mirror image of that is sort of true with regards to the European Union, where there is a credibility issue amongst many Israelis with regards to the EU, whether fair or unfair. And if you have these two biggest sort of geopolitical entities, two biggest donor states to the region, there's 3 Security Council seats, I guess, distributed between Europe and the United States, the logic of multilateralism is overwhelming. And I think the early statements from both President-elect Biden and one of his chief foreign policy surrogates, Tony Blinken, are encouraging. And just to reference what Lucy said as well, I mean, it's a return to multilateralism, which they're saying quite explicitly and has been something of a forbidden word in Washington for the last few years. But there's also an Atlanticism there that's actually, I think, maybe distinct to the Obama administration, that if I remember correctly, after the election in 2008, there was obviously the talk of the pivot toward Asia, and there was certainly a lot of overheated talk in Europe about whether or not Obama felt the transatlantic relationship the same way as previous Democratic presidents had. I think with Joe Biden, that's not really an issue. He's such a long-standing Atlanticist and a supporter of multilateral institutions. And I think whilst Israel-Palestine may not be the prime interest, not just globally, but even in the region for the administration, I think reviving multilateralism and US leadership within it will be a prime issue on the agenda. And that can be something the Europeans and the incoming Biden administration can work fairly diligently on together. And it's worthwhile pointing out, we haven't really had a multilateral approach to this conflict since 1991, really, since Madrid. And with the benefit of hindsight, you can say that that was really one of the high points of international engagement on this issue. And something that's also happened in recent years, which could allow a more broad and multilateral engagement to break new ground, are the Gulf normalization deals that were spoken about earlier as well. Now, whilst we may be critical or be cynical about some of the intention with the outgoing administration, potentially with some of the Israeli voices who are powering along the agreements, there is utility in looking at those arrangements and trying to turn them into something genuinely disruptive and something that can be built around. I think, if you look at Madrid, it involved Arab stakeholders, but in a very different guise than would be the case now if you were to bring in the wider region into something genuinely multilateral, potentially under the auspices of the Quartet also. Even in the last year, there has been renewed kind of conversations and talking points around a revived role for the Quartet, and that could be a ready-to-go instrument that an incoming Biden administration may choose to try and revive. It's also interesting to think about the bilateral relationships with Europe and the United States and how they might evolve over the coming period. The EU-Israel Joint Council has been suspended now for 8 years, I think, because of European objection to Israeli settlement policy. And President Macron here in France has been rumored to be thinking about some sort of grand bargain to potentially revive it in the wake of annexation being suspended, but to try and attach some meaningful progress on policy in the West Bank as part of it, maybe confidence building measures, some sort of interim agreement. We're also hearing possibly that further GCC normalization may be dependent on conditions like that as well. So I'm just thinking out loud, there could be a potential, particularly within a multilateral framework, to have European, US, and GCC policy norms sort of codified into a real strategy. And I think one of the things we haven't had over the last few years is open channels of conversation and discussion between actors in Europe and the United States. So just even that coordinating mechanism being revived again opens up possibilities that we haven't really been able to explore, not just for the last 4 years, but really since 2014. So it's worthwhile reflecting on how some of those might change. With regards to policy to the Palestinians as well, what will be interesting to see is whether or not the European Union continues to push as forcefully for Palestinian elections in the coming year. I'm not sure whether the Biden incoming administration or people close to him have said anything about that issue. It has been something the EU have been pressing for. If one of the main concerns on the Palestinian side about following through on elections is not being able to operate them in East Jerusalem, but this is another example of how cooperation between America and Europe can make a big difference, because in 2006, that was possible, East Jerusalem elections for Palestinians there, thanks to US pressure that was applied. The Europeans would never have been able to deliver the results the Bush administration did. So again, that opens up some possible avenues. And then as well on the Iran deal, which I know that Lucy mentioned earlier, and I think is probably going to be one of the most important policy goals, both for Europe and the United States over the first part of any incoming Biden administration. And I think that also opens up opportunities on that sort of multilateral framework, because the Vienna process was much more multilateral, I think, than many others we've seen in the Middle East space. But then also something that has changed even over the last few months is European posture towards Turkey and Qatar as part of that. And I think there's been a hardening, particularly here in France, but I think also in many other European capitals. And as the Palestinian Authority and the PLO has been sort of, flirting a little bit with a realignment towards that bloc, it's worthwhile taking into account what that would mean for European relations, as well as the relations for an incoming Biden administration. And that's also connected to funding. Over the last year, since the start of 2020, we've really seen a collapse, obviously in US funding, which other speakers will address in more detail than I will, but also funding from the Arab world, which I think is reduced by 85% or thereabouts this year. It's extraordinary. So the European Union is now funding the Palestinian Authority 10 times more than the entire Arab world combined. So again, going back to that kind of grand bargain motif, maybe there's a way of connecting a few of these things, from the prisoner payment to some of the challenges around the Anti-Terrorism Clarification Act and the Taylor Force Act, and seeing which actors are structurally able to fund which elements of a comprehensive strategy that is that addresses all the key concerns working toward that two-state solution. And then the final thing I'll say is around sort of being proactive rather than reactive. One of the concerns that I have is that, and you're seeing this at the moment actually with Give Atomatos today, a crisis comes along, what political capital is available is deployed on trying to solve that crisis, which is very worthwhile and should still happen, but it means that you're not trying to move the ball forward. You're trying to restore a status quo that was, you know, very much unsatisfactory to begin with, rather than create something better in its place. So I would hope that there will be a more far-reaching strategy that looks over the 4 years in a long-term way and seeing what can be built. And then finally, that civil society will be at the center of that. So as Lucy mentioned, we have a piece of legislation that we're really hoping will be enacted before the end of this year, which has multilateralism at its core. There's a debate taking place tomorrow in Westminster on the same issue, on the International Fund for British MPs, to see how Britain might be involved. The British government, the previous Conservative British government, endorsed this in 2018. And I think the reality is the political variables in the region, both from a leadership perspective, but also a civic perspective, are misaligned. And if the Europeans and the Americans have a limited amount of political bandwidth to deploy on this, I'd like them to take a 4-year approach and really try and strengthen civil society, change some of those conditions, and increase the chances, particularly if there's some political changes over those 4 years more locally, to increase the chances of success on another round of diplomacy, not to do it just for performative reasons, but to set yourself up to succeed. And I think an international fund can be a civic part of that, but there's also things that could be done on the state building initiative with the Palestinian Authority, and really plan it out with as many partners as possible around the table. So that will be our hope at ALLMEP of what we see over the next 4 years.
Thank you very much, John. And we will move on now to Kevin Rachlin, the US Director at ALLMEP. Kevin served as the Director of Public Policy and Government Affairs at Interaction. He also served for about 7 years at J Street, and as the Director of Governmental Affairs for the Basic Education Coalition, working with leading NGO organizations to elevate global education within the US government. Kevin will elaborate a bit more about the American perspective, maybe focusing a bit about the Congress work, continuing what Lucy was talking about. Kevin, you have 5 minutes. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you, Mitvim, for co-hosting with us on this really timely panel at this point in time. We're excited to be here, both myself, Huda, and John, to kind of brief everyone on the ramifications of the U.S. election, on what's going on in the region right now. So I'm gonna focus primarily on Congress, just because that's where all the fun is right now. And you know, just so folks understand, you know, Congress does not come back. You know, there's a lame duck session going on right now, but what I'll be talking about is the 117th Congress, which gets sworn in on January 3rd. So just to take a top line step up on this, so people understand, is that, you know, at this point in time, Congress will most likely end up being what we call a split Congress here at this point. Right now, that's where we're seeing things. You'll have a democratically controlled House of Representatives and currently a Senate controlled by the Republicans. Although there are 2 special elections in Georgia that are taking place in early January that could really change the makeup of the Senate. Right now, it's 48 Democrats to 50 Republicans. If the Democrats are able to flip both seats, then it becomes a 50-50 tie with the vice president as the tiebreaker going forward, which would just mean a very, it's a different type of Senate that we haven't seen in a long, long time. In terms of the House, you know, Democrats have controlled the House since 2018, and they are keeping the House going forward. Right now, they have lost several seats in this election, which was, you know, it was something that nobody, the pollsters, ourselves, others that were following this, really expected at this point in time. But the Democrats will maintain control of the House of Representatives. In terms of leadership and what's happening on Capitol Hill, and where all these people are going and what's happening, there are 2 key figures I want to point out that are leading Capitol Hill right now. The first is Chairwoman Nita Lowey, who is the chairwoman of the powerful House Appropriations Committee. She's retiring, and Chairman Eliot Engel who is the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Both of these individuals have a massive amount of power on Israeli-Palestinian politics on Capitol Hill, and they are both going to no longer be in Congress as of January 2nd. And so there will be a massive jockeying for positions on Capitol Hill between who is going to be taking on those major seats. I'm not going to really dive into the positions on everybody involved in those races, but I do want to flag that in terms of House Appropriations, it's Rosa DeLauro, who's from Connecticut, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, a very prominent Jewish congresswoman from Florida, as well as Marcy Kaptur from Ohio. And then in terms of House Foreign Affairs, you're seeing a real race in between the most senior member of the committee, who is Brad Sherman from California, and then a progressive, Joaquin Castro from Texas, as well as a Congressional Black Caucus member who's very prominent in Congress, Greg Meeks from New York. And so you're seeing a real jostling for power in terms of who's going to end up taking over House Foreign Affairs going forward. In terms of the Senate and those committees, I don't expect much changeover happening there unless the Democrats take control, and then there'll be a bit of a jostling, I'm sure, in terms of who controls what committees, who sits on each committee, because in the Senate, the majority determines how many are actually able to sit on each committee, and obviously the majority gets the most. And so you'll see senators shifting seats if that does end up happening. But currently at this point in time, I'm expecting Lindsey Graham to continue chairing the State Foreign Ops Subcommittee on Appropriations. In the Senate, I'm expecting Senator Risch from Idaho to continue chairing the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, as well as Shelby doing the full Appropriations Committee as well. So those are kind of like the top line things that folks need to understand. But I do want to flag one more seat that is opening up completely on the House side, just so folks understand it. And that's the powerful subcommittee on State Foreign Ops Appropriations. That was formerly held by Ms. Lowy, and when she retires, she will no longer be there. And it's expected at this point in time that Barbara Lee, who's the highest ranking Democrat on that subcommittee, to assume that role, which is good on all numerous fronts. She's in support of all of the issues that we all love and support, but I think she's on the more progressive side. So it'll just breathe some different air into that committee and into the appropriations process going forward. In terms of, what will Congress do on this issue right now? I think, one of the things that we always say, I think Lucy touched on a bit and John touched on a bit, is that, it always seems to come back to Congress. And the reason is because Israel-Palestine is the most over-legislated issue on Capitol Hill right now. There are resolutions galore, there's letters, there's bills, there's new language past every moment in time. So I think the real question is, what is actually going to happen in terms of aid, in terms of Israeli aid and the Palestinian aid? And two, will there be policy changes going forward on Capitol Hill? So let's start with aid, because I think that's the thing that a lot of people are interested in. Let's start with Israeli military aid, because I think that's another real big question. We saw during the last 4 years that the Trump administration as with all the previous administrations, continue the MOU to provide Israel with military aid, and I think you'll see that continue going forward into the 117th. What I think you might see different, and what we saw towards the end of this year when annexation became a real conversation, is how that money is being spent, and more importantly, where it's being spent. And so I think you might start to see more members of Congress not question the aid, but try to insert language into bills and whatnot to kind of identify where that aid is going, and to make sure that the Department of Defense, the State Department, and USAID, and all others that actually obligate and spend that money, that there's a real accounting of where those dollars are, because there's a lot of concern that some of that dollars might be going into the West Bank and Gaza, and that might be not into the intent of what some members of Congress want. So you might see that start coming up going forward. In terms of aid to the Palestinians, this is something where I think we'll see there's, I think, broad agreement between the incoming Biden administration as well as the vast majority of Congress, which is everyone agrees that we need to restart aid, specifically development and humanitarian aid to the West Bank and Gaza. There is unanimous consent about that in the House passed appropriations bill this couple months ago, actually. $225 million were allocated in that bill specifically for West Bank Gaza foreign assistance. In the just introduced Senate bill last week, it was 75 million. So that's one of the first times in both bills that you see a hard mark for aid going into the West Bank and Gaza, which previously was never really there. It was always understood, or it was in the report language, but this is the first time in quite a number of years that it's actually inside the bill text. So that's a positive sign. And also they are reacting to the fact that there are millions of people that are suffering, and they see development and humanitarian aid as not something that is negotiable in terms of what should be spent and how it should be spent, that this is going to civil society and to people that are in real need inside the West Bank and Gaza. And that's why there are so many people that not only supported it in the FY21 appropriations bill, but also in the FY20 Trump signed bill that actually allocated an additional $75 million for the West Bank and Gaza. Then there is the question of the PA, the PLO, and funding going there as well. So as we've alluded to on this call already, ACCA, which is the Anti-Terrorism Clarification Act, had a fix last year. That bill essentially provided, cut off all further aid to remaining aid to the PA, but also really horribly, it cut all the development and humanitarian aid going into the West Bank and Gaza. And this caused all programs to really just shut off immediately. We were very happy to see that in December of last year, Congress recognized this problem and fixed it by passing a fix on ACCA to allow aid to go to civil society without linking it to jurisdiction in U.S. courts. That being said, part of that fix was also including Taylor Force language, and I'll tell you what that is in a second, as part of that to kind of give an additional hook on how to apply jurisdiction to the PA and the PLO. And Taylor Force, for those who don't know, was a bill that was passed in late 2017, early 2018, that essentially cut off all aid to the PA and the PLO because of their payments to the Martyr Fund. And that was very specific attack on them. And it's intended to try to really just put as much pressure on the PA and the PLO as possible. The question is there room to really change these bills going forward, or to amend them in any way, shape, or form? I think in the near term, you're not going to see Taylor Force nor ACCA changed much more. That's not to say that there can't be executive action on both of these bills, on both of these laws, in terms of what the president-elect can actually do at this point in time into changing those bills, or how he enforces those bills. So I think you might not see as much movement on the Hill on that, but you may see movement on the president-elect's side. And then finally, because I just have to say it, and because it's also really exciting, as Lucy, John, and everyone we've talked about, one of the things that we're extremely positive, and it has broad support across Democrats, Republicans, and almost every pro-peace, pro-Israel supporting organization, is the potential passage of the Middle East Partnership for Peace Act, which is, it was, as we all kind of talked about, is included in the recent appropriations bill in the House and identified in the Senate version that was just introduced last week. And this is the first truly groundbreaking piece of legislation that has been introduced since pretty much Oslo, to inject $50 million per year into peace building across Israel and Palestine. And it's supported not just by Republicans, but by Democrats as well, and very powerful ones on both sides, Nita Lowey, Lindsey Graham, et cetera. And so we're really confident and excited that this bill is just about to get over the finish line. I'm going to pause because I'm talking a lot, and I want to kick it back over to you. And I'll answer questions later.
Thank you, Kevin. Now we have, last but not least, we have with us Nadav Tamir, a board member at Mitvim Institute and the Senior Director of International Affairs and Government Relations at the Paris Center for Peace and Innovation. Prior to this, Nadav served as the Senior Policy Advisor to President Shimon Peres. He also served as Israel's Consul General to New England at the Consulate General in Boston. So Nadav, you have about 5 minutes, and after this, we will open up the floor. We've had already some questions in the chat and in the Q&A, and we will relate to everything in a few minutes. Thank you, Nadav.
Thank you so much, Merav. It's great to be here in Mitvim and ALLMEP, two organizations where I feel very much at home, and with all the friends that I see on my Zoom that are all people that I worked with in the past, and it's an honor to be speaking with all of you. You heard from many experts about rational things, and I want to actually take you more to the world of fantasy. I'm a student of Shimon Peres, who taught me that fantastic things can only happen to people who fantasize. So I can't really speak to what the Israeli government will do. I know that the Israeli system is now facing crisis, a prime minister that is going to start a trial, elections might coming every day. So I don't think there's anyone who could really forecast what Israel is going to do. So I do want to focus on the president-elect Biden. Like all of you who want peace and want the two-state solution, I was hoping for his win. And I was in a lot of stress that I'm going to be mistaken again, like I was in 2016. But I want to say that it's not enough for Biden to be opposite of Trump. It's not enough. Not enough to be another Obama or another Clinton. I want to remind you that the two presidents that actually did something significant in terms of the strategic situation in the Middle East are Carter, who brought the Egypt-Israel agreement. And I want to remind you, Egypt is the largest and the strongest Arab country in the world, and the peace with Israel is huge. It was a Likud government when Carter actually made this happen. And nobody expected Carter to be able to do it. He was a nobody that came from Georgia with no expectations whatsoever. Another president that I think was very consequential was Bush the father, Bush 41, that actually used the end of the Cold War and the way the first Gulf War ended to drag Shamir, another Likud prime minister, to Madrid. And Madrid was a very important junction, because Madrid opened up diplomatic relations for Israel all over the world, China, India, and as John said, also was a great demonstration of multilateralism, which the Bush first administration was very good at, in also NATO and everything that was done in that period. So I want to hope that against all our expectations, Biden is going to be much larger than Biden. I want to speak about the sense of urgency that some people spoke about. For me, the Arikat passing reminds me of this sense of urgency. We remember the age of Abbas, and maybe Biden's age as well will cause him some sense of urgency to do something much more significant than just going back to CBMs or whatever, because we might face a situation where eventually we won't have Arikats and Abbas on the other side. We will have either people that say, forget about the two-state solution, let's just wait for a one-state and get demography to work, or people who will go back to Hamas and even worse. So I really think that as an activist for peace, we have to think big, and we have to speak to the American next administration that actually we don't need a new plan. We have plenty plans. We have the Saudi initiative, and we have the Geneva Accords, and we have the General Allen plan for security that was not implemented, as we remember. What we need is political will. We need a president that acts like a superpower and not trying to cause it up to some lobbyists on Congress, which is the comfort zone of Biden. Biden was always kind of an AIPAC person, but with the new winds in the Democratic Party, and I think he should go for much more than just going back to before Trump, and he could go for kind of the deal of the century, which is a Trump language, but it can be done much better with Biden. One of the things many people mentioned, the new regional situation can be used to his advantage. You know, some people in the left in Israel think that the Abrahamic Accords, meaning forgetting about the Palestinians. I actually think that the Abrahamic Accords could be used to advance the Palestinian issue. I think that the fact that Saudi Arabia is very much now worried that the new American administration will go back to human rights and Yemen and Khashoggi and all kinds of things that they got to pass by. And Biden will have the levers to use with Saudi Arabia and with the other Gulf countries and use also the enthusiasm in Israel about the Abrahamic Accord to do something much bigger than just going back to the pre-Trump era. So I know it sounds like a pipe dream, but I think we should hope for something much bigger, and we should push for something much bigger because time is running out, and too many facts on the ground and too many, the loss of hope could become irreversible if we won't do something dramatic. I'll end here and I'll be happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Nadav, and actually thank you for all of our speakers. We have now a few questions, some of that you've already seen at the Q&A box, and also I see, Huda, that you related to at least one of the questions. I think we will do a short round, and for the audience, feel free to add a little bit more questions if you have. I see that we have a few questions regarding the next possible steps of annexation and the way that the U.S. administration might react to that. So maybe Lucy, if you want to answer, can you see the questions or? Yeah. Wait, you need to unmute, please.
I do indeed. All right, I'm looking at these questions now. So you said you'd like me to speak to, I'm just pulling up the questions. You said a question on annexation.
Yes, we actually have, we have both. We have one for annexation and the latest bid of to building new housing units in the West Bank.
Okay. How would we might reflect? I mean, just quickly, and to reiterate some of what I mentioned, the Biden Harris, the surrogates have been very clear, as I said, number one, on two-state solution as it had been understood under what was the so-called international consensus for a while is the goal. And they've been very clear on their opposition to annexation, which was made clear during the time when that was very much on the near-term table, when people were concerned that there would be an announcement in July, which ostensibly was cut short with the advent of the Abraham Accords. I think there were other reasons that that was put minimally on the back burner. I think the question on a lot of people is annexation, and that's what's often referred to as creeping annexation. You can take the big annexation off the table, but I think as this question about settlement buildings referring to, what about ongoing settlement announcements and what's happening on a daily basis on the ground? A couple of people today have mentioned recent activities surrounding Givat Hamatos. And I think one of the things to keep in mind is that Biden, again, is no stranger to this conflict, to some of these relationships. And some of you might recall a moment of tension with him back in, March 2010, first term of the Obama administration. Biden went out to the region to try to kickstart talks between Israelis and Palestinians, and was greeted essentially when he arrived on the ground with an announcement of, I think, 1,600 new units in East Jerusalem, something along those lines. This was not something he took too kindly. It was an embarrassment, as I remember at the time. There was some notion that the Prime Minister himself was embarrassed by it. It was a move made by one of his ministers. But I say all this background to say that I think, as I alluded to in my comments, that the new incoming administration is not going to want to go right in and engage in, and start off on a hostile footing with the Israeli government. I would imagine the government of Israel would have the same calculation in the other direction. So I think that you can certainly we can expect to continue to see opposition to the large-scale annexation. I think you will minimally, again, continue to see clear articulation against new settlement announcements. and condemning moves that they see again as running counter to the priorities that they have set themselves. What you will see in terms of larger scale pushback, especially given some of the dynamics in Congress Kevin has laid out, is I think a question remains to be seen, but there is still certainly across the Democratic Party and still in the Republican Party, commitment to the idea of a two-state solution and understanding that that cannot happen meaningfully as long as, certainly if if annexation of any form continues to happen. So I mean, it's definitely something that to watch. Was there another question I'm supposed to address at this point, Meirav? Sorry, if you can point me to the.
I think we will now move on. Maybe Huda or John, if you want to take up, we had a few questions about the civil society work. You both touched upon it a little bit, of what and if the civil society can do with the new administration in order to push forward the. Do you see a role for people-to-people work to move the Biden administration toward a more positive role, for example? And maybe so we can make this more effective. I will also say that there's a question for Nimrod and maybe also Nadav about the Israeli government, and is it actually possible for the new administration to work with this, or should we wait for a change with the Israeli, maybe with next elections? So Huda, you want to start? Then we'll give the stage to Nimrod.
There was a question directed at me about what I meant by the civil society putting out there a proposal. And I want to address that in a sense of urgency, because again, I started my conversation by saying this is a very, very busy administration. And I don't have many expectations when it comes to their priority towards the Middle East and Israel and Palestine. So what we need to do is to get this administration involved by initiating a proposal created by the civil society. And there are items on the two-state solutions that not many Palestinians and not many Israelis actually agree with or see eye to eye. From the work that I'm doing with thousands of Israelis and Palestinians through dialogue or direct action or education, I can see that there is a trend towards not thinking that the two-state solution is the only framework. So this is something that we need to stop and think about and hear more voices, and maybe can come up with creative ideas. I do believe that the Israeli government has pulled the plug on the two-state solution. I do believe that the Palestinian Authority still believes that it's the only framework for them. But in between, there are people who are living in the annexed, will be annexed areas, or in the West Bank or in Gaza, who have different opinions. And as a civil society activist, peace building, trust building activist, whatever, I think it's important to bring these voices into the fold. And I feel that there will be some sort of creativity when we open up the conversation beyond just the leaders who had not moved a nudge since 1995 until now. And again, it's about the Biden administration and the expectations. We cannot have high expectations, but we need to make initiatives to pull back the Biden administration into the fold in a way that is not violent, as it always happens.
I just want to add just two quick things to what Huda said around civil society's role. The Biden administration would do well to speak to the Obama administration, which should be quite easy for Joe Biden. If you think of what John Kerry said and his final remarks as his outgoing Secretary of State, he said, "We didn't fail because the gaps are too big. We failed because there was no trust between both parties," right? So trust needs to be built from the bottom up. And we know from other conflicts, Northern Ireland most pressingly, that sort of work at scale before a final status process increases its chance of success, and also generates some of the ideas that can help to frame final status, and creates a base that will support a US president on both sides of the green line if they want to engage more deeply. And that's something we haven't really had since Clinton, to be very honest. And then the second thing is what Obama said as well in his speech in Jerusalem. He said, and it was a universal point of politicians, that politicians won't make difficult decisions. They won't take risks unless people push them towards it. That's what happened with Menachem Begin, with the Sadat visit. He was pressured by public opinion to move beyond his comfort zone. The same also with Shamir ahead of the Madrid process. And even Bibi in his first term as well, with regards to White River, there was push coming from civil society. We need to, and a smart policymaker needs to invest in that sort of capacity in order to strengthen the hand of diplomats. And if you look at the graph of funding for this work, it's been declining now year on year for 6 years. And there's lots of reasons why we are where we are, but that is one of the data points that needs to be addressed. And I hope it's a priority for the incoming administration.
Thank you, Nimrod. If you can relate, and I think afterwards we will immediately move to Nadav and then Kevin, so you can relate also to some of the questions that was raised here. And unfortunately, we do not have a lot of time, so in maybe 2 or 3 minutes for everyone. Nimrod.
Thank you, Merav. I will relate to the question that you addressed to me, although there are many others in the Q&A that are relevant. The question was whether an American policy can move Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu to adopt a different policy on the Israeli-Palestinian issue. And unfortunately, my answer to that is no. I think Netanyahu has made very clear over the last few years what is his agenda on the Israeli-Palestinian issue. And from a place of some vagueness on his real policy goals, he has been declaring very openly that he wants to prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state. So if in the early days of the Obama administration, we saw Netanyahu agree to a short-term settlement freeze and then do the Bar-Ilan speech somehow supporting a two-state solution in principle, although meaning a very different version of that, over time, we see Netanyahu talking about expanding the split between the West Bank and Gaza as a way to prevent a discourse about a two-state solution. We saw Netanyahu working to split the EU member states in order to prevent EU action to promote a two-state solution, and very clear messaging and saying that out in the open. So Netanyahu, I think, will not be the one to promote that. His major coalition partner now, Blue and White Party with Benny Gantz, Gabi Ashkenazi, were instrumental in stopping the discourse about annexation, but we see them now giving a green light to settlement expansion. So I don't think the hope will come from there as well. And as you mentioned, civil society, I think the role now of empowering or rebuilding the Israeli peace camp, both on the civil society level and on the political level, requires very clear messaging on the two-state solution, on Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking. We see in Mitvim polls that the public does not prioritize the Israeli-Palestinian issue anymore, but linking it a bit to the Abraham Accords, there is now a renewed discourse in Israel about peace, about regional cooperation, about hope, and much like Nadav said, that could be leveraged to open up Israelis to feel more secure, more at ease, to talk about concessions on other fronts, more important fronts, the Palestinian one.
I'm not used to disagree with Nimrod, but I do want to disagree about Netanyahu's motives. I think Netanyahu, there are two sides to Netanyahu. There is the ideological Netanyahu, the son of his father, and you know, but more than anything else, Netanyahu is a survivalist, you know, politically and now legally. And the way to deal with Netanyahu is pressure. I mean, if you'll ask Benny Gantz and Ashkenazi, now they understand that they should have listened to Lieberman and Lapid, who knows Netanyahu. With Netanyahu, it's not about trust, it's about pressure. It's about, and for example, I think that if after the Bar-Ilan speech, if Obama would have come to Netanyahu and said to him, listen, you asked in your Bar-Ilan speech for two things. You asked for a recognition of Israel as a homeland of the Jewish people, and you asked for a Palestinian state without a military. I'm going to give you those two things through a Security Council resolution, but you will give me 67 borders with land swaps and Jerusalem capital in East Jerusalem. And there are two ways for you. Either you declare victory because you got what you wanted in Bar-Ilan, or I'm moving without you and I'm leaving you behind. I'm moving with the Europeans, with the Russians, with the Chinese. I think Netanyahu might have calculated differently. And the same with the annexation. I mean, Netanyahu, for his base and for his ideology, he wanted to annex, and also Trump for his evangelical support. But when Kushner heard from all the Arab countries that they're not going to support this policy, eventually they decided to declare victory without annexation. And so I think that with Netanyahu, it's less about trust because and it's much more about power, about putting him in a situation where he has no other option. Now, I hope that he's not going to stay long on the scene, and we will be able to think about other leaders. One of the things that I do agree with Nimrod is that there is, you know, when you check, the public in Israel were more supportive of the Abrahamic Accords than annexations, and the public in Israel is really excited about this new kind of normalization in the region, and that could be played you know, by Biden as something that could get support of Israelis. I want to remind all of you that when Sharon was elected, he said Netzarim and Tel Aviv are the same. Netzarim was a settlement in Gaza, and eventually he got support. And when he sat on the Prime Minister's office, he decided to move out of Gaza, and he still got support. So people are mostly confused in Israel. And with leadership coming from America and from us, the activists, we could make things happen, just like John said, and we have to think proactively and not wait for things to come our way.
Thank you, Nadav. Kevin, would you like to relate in a few minutes, 2 to 3 minutes?
I'll try. And so I kind of want to take a step back to DC and kind of this hope that, you know, with the new Biden administration, everything's going to change immediately, and there will be a lot of hope there. And I do want to stress the fact that is hopeful that the president-elect will do a number of things to alter and change where things are going on the issue of Israel-Palestinian peace. But I do want to stress that it's going to also have to come from folks on the ground in the region as well, between Israelis and Palestinians themselves, to really do this. We're here, we're trying, you know, ALLMEP as others, we're trying to provide funding to kind of create and build those relationships and really make them stronger. But it's going to be really indicative on what's happening on the ground. And I think that, just as Lucy said at the beginning, that, you know, the president-elect has, you know, a number of issues that he's going to want to tackle, you know, Iran and you know, preventing any war with Iran that could potentially be happening, which we all thought could have potentially been happening earlier this year, and kind of trying to figure out a way to renegotiate the JCPOA and get back into that agreement, or get back into compliance at least as much as possible. But I think that for Israel-Palestine, he's going to be kind of keeping it at arm's length, that it's going to require folks like us and others on Capitol Hill to really push the conversation to engage in different methods of achieving peace, or to set the ground for peace. I think some of the things that we say consistently is, how do we build a new constituency for peace in the region, right there? And that requires real hard work, and it's going to take a long time to get there as well. And so that is one of the reasons why we all talk about this. So I think, you know, that part of it is, you know, pressuring the president-elect, pressuring members of Congress, but also looking at ourselves in the region. I'm not Israeli, obviously. I'm not Palestinian either. But all I can do is support and be an ally to all of you out there. But at the same time, it's really critical that we start to look at ourselves and try to figure out, how do we create a sustainable future for both Israelis and Palestinians. And I think that's where, you know, the president-elect will end up going, is how do we actually do that effectively going forward.
Thank you, Kevin. So our time is up, but if anyone wants to say maybe one statement for each speaker to close this event. Lucy, we can start by you.
Thanks, Meirav. I think we've covered a lot of ground. There's so much more left to cover. I don't have much more to add. I've tried to address a couple of the questions in the chat box. I would just say there's one question I saw from Inga addressed to Nadav and me, asking about, isn't there incentive, given how long the policy wheels take to turn, what's to stop oppositional forces just kind of waiting out this kind of administration? And I think that's always a concern. I mentioned a couple of times in my remarks the idea that I don't think you can expect an incoming Biden administration to do a 180 on all of these issues, precisely, I think, out of awareness of this issue that the world has gotten used to not in a good way, a bit of whiplash with American policy on many of these issues. And this expectation that, okay, if you don't like when it's going one way, 4 years, maybe 8 years later, you can just expect another approach. And so I do think, again, I sort of a theme throughout my remarks, a management of expectation caution of everything suddenly being pivoted back to exactly where it was. I think this is an administration that is like to be very mindful of, again, we've talked about a return to multilateralism, engaging the interests and concerns of other actors and its allies, including, and this question was specifically about the Iran deal. I think Biden is well aware that a lot of the tension between the Obama administration and Netanyahu government, and those two personalities particularly, came from an Israeli and Gulf state notion that there were efforts on the Iran front proceeding without their knowledge, behind their back, as it were. And so I think you might be seeing more of an approach by an incoming administration to engage its allies at least a bit more on some of these policy decisions it is weighing and making. And maybe we can get to a point, to start to get to a point where the whiplash isn't to be expected. And thank you to both Mitvim and ALLMEP again for convening this conversation.
Thank you very much, Lucy. John, would you like to?
Yeah, just very briefly, I would say, look, I think it's been a running theme for pretty much every panelist here. There's a lot the Biden administration can do. We hope they will. We hope they'll work very closely, obviously, with European partners and with the emerging dynamics in the Gulf. But it needs to also be driven by Israelis and Palestinians. I think that's what we at ALLMEP, obviously, and as outsiders, are trying to do, is to strengthen the work, to provide the resources for peace builders in the region, to really drive and change the narrative and the development. And if I could just plug very quickly, we're going to have an event on the 15th of December at ALLMEP, where we'll be shining a light on those peace builders. I'll put a link into the chat bar, but I'd urge everybody to please RSVP. We'll be joined by many of the sponsors of the legislation we've been speaking about, the Middle East Partnership for Peace Act, so really senior members of Congress and Senate, as well as European politicians that support this project, and some figures from entertainment who want to try and add credibility and weight and shine a light on, as I said, the members in the region working for peace. So please do join us for that. And it's been a dark year, so it'd be nice to end it on something optimistic and maybe look toward how the Biden administration, again, working with partners, can really change the dynamic over the coming 4 years.
Thank you. Nimrod, words of closure for this event?
Yeah, thank you. I think that's main messages that the Israeli-Palestinian issue, although many people sideline it, is a vital issue for Israel's future and the Palestinian future. And for us, it's a top priority. And even if a specific solution seems very difficult to obtain, that is the goal that we need to work with, and we need to transform this difficulty into hope and conflict resolution. In that process, the role of the international community is an important one, and we can benefit from it a lot, and we should welcome it. And multilateralism is an asset, but eventually peace will come from Israeli and Palestinian efforts on the ground. We can work with the international community, but it cannot replace our work both on the political official level or at the grassroots civil society level.
Thank you. Nadav, you have something to add?
Yes, I want to thank all the people that are watching, that I assume are people who care about peace, and remind all of you that it's not enough to have a critical mind. We need a hopeful heart. Without optimism, we can't do anything, and many of us are in despair too often. So I want to say to both Mitvim and to ALLMEP that we're talking about two organizations that are trying, Mitvim on the policy level and ALLMEP on the grassroots level, to support optimism and support activism and support pro-activism, and it's very necessary. So you can't understand how small things can influence, and everybody who is doing something for peace should just do their thing and keep on believing, and one day it will come.
I want to thank everyone, both the speakers and the audience. So we've had a question. This event is recorded, and we will probably upload it to Facebook and social networks. So really thank you everyone for joining us, speaking on this important issue. Thank you.